HRN listeners. As we celebrate our 15th year, we are deepening our commitment to giving voice to the next generation of food systems storytellers, and we need your help. Our internship and fellowship programs help activate new possibilities for underrepresented and underestimated young people through experiential journalism, audio engineering, and production training. Through these unique programs, HRN helps food equity stewards build essential workforce readiness skills that expand their potential and foster economic mobility. Please consider supporting these critical programs. And with a minimum donation, you can be entered to win a dinner for two at an amazing restaurant in one of 8 cities and tickets to a concert at a great venue in one of those cities. We have incredible partners across the country who have donated, as they also share our passion for helping to educate the next generation of food systems storytellers. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. And make sure you donate before March 31st. Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Kermit Lynch Wine Merchant. Learn more at kermitlynch.com.
This week on Meat and Three, we celebrate Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month with an episode about memory.
I've always read and sort of approached cookbooks for more than the recipes. To me, they are full of narrative content and narrative value.
So Malamaaina basically means to take care of the land. For us as Hawaiians, it's taking care of our older sibling.
But I do remember definitely feeling self-conscious about it, being the only one who kind of wasn't eating a sandwich and didn't have a bag of goldfish or Lunchables.
Listen to Meat and Three wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to The Grape Nation, your weekly wine journey. Our guest is Eric Asimov. We'll talk to Eric about the past, the present, and the future. I know that sounds vague, but there's a lot in there. I'm your host, Sam Ben-Ruby. Stay with us for The Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We bring wine to the people. Eric Asimov is the chief wine critic for the New York Times. His tenure with the newspaper goes back to 1984. His column on wine appears Wednesdays in the food section of the Times. His monthly wine school column enlightens and invites you to drink and discuss wine with him. He has published numerous books and guides, including How to Love Wine, a memoir and a manifesto. Eric is a prolific tweeter and a fellow New York Jets fan, I'm happy to say. Welcome to the Grape Nation, Eric. Welcome back to the Grape Nation.
Thank you. Go Jets.
That's right. New era. Let's not get too exuberant. We could talk about it at the end. All right. We're talking to Eric remotely via Zencastr. Eric, where are you?
I'm in my apartment in Manhattan, where I've been most of the last 15 months.
Okay, so as you worked, for the Times this past year and a half or whatever, you've been doing it out of your apartment, pretty much haven't left, right? Up until recently, maybe?
Yeah, I've not been a hermit, but,
right.
I haven't basically left the city. I've been in the apartment, working in the apartment. It's been like everybody else in the pandemic.
Yep.
There's a lot of adjustments.
Yep. I've been talking about every aspect of the pandemic for the past year with basically all my guests, hard not to escape it. I'm hoping now that the pandemic is winding down and maybe it won't be so much top of mind. And I want to discuss the effects of the pandemic. So I want to get right into it with you. You just said that you've been in Manhattan, you've been in your apartment, and you've been working. You publish a weekly column with the Times. How did the pandemic change your life, other than that physical aspect that you weren't in the office?
Well, first of all, I had to cancel, a lot of trips that I had planned to take, some of which I had already bought plane tickets for.
Right.
And, along with those trips are quite a few articles that I had planned to write, which, was impossible. But,
right.
You adjust. When current events brings you a different set of circumstances, it changes one's beat as well. And obviously it changed the kinds of stories that I had planned to write. And I ended up instead writing about how the pandemic was affecting the wine business, trying to figure out articles that would address the concerns of readers, like early on when it all seemed, in New York City that we would be quite isolated for a while. I wrote about the issue of drinking alone. Right. And how our society views that, and maybe how people could safely do that.
Right.
So there's a lot of different approaches you have to take.
So we can all understand this. On a typical year, I mean, your column is affected by travel, among other things. You get an opportunity, abroad and here to visit, taste, see people. How many trips, on average, would you typically take in a year?
Well, last year I probably would have gone to Europe at least 3 times.
Wow.
I would have been on the West Coast several times, including right around or after the fires that hit Napa.
Right. Right.
And other than that, things happen and you don't necessarily know in advance that a trip is suddenly going to be likely. Right. So, all of those are kind of the basic nuts and bolts of writing about wine. There's nothing like visiting the place and seeing the people and, inhaling the air in vineyards and just sensing the cultural vibe that might that goes into producing a certain wine. And these things happen as news happens. Something might occur to me and a great story suggests itself. Right. I think I've got a backlog now of those stories, and I'm hoping to catch up in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it. It's probably going to take years. When did you realize, I think mid-late February, there were stories in the news, and then March it started ramping up, and by the middle end of March, it was here. Yeah. When did it change and you were looking down the barrel of a gun where you had something planned, and like you said, now you had to improvise and come up with a different story, or a story that wouldn't be based on travel? When did you realize all this?
Well, it was right at the beginning of March. I had there were a couple of things that I had done. I think that I last saw you at the 2020 Charleston Wine and Food Festival, which
Eric, we were there right before the shit hit the fan.
Right before the shit hit the fan, and I came back from that and went directly to a huge dinner at La Paulée, which was celebrating its 20th year in New York, and that at that event. I really hit me that all of these people were gathered together, and none of them were following the protocols that were just beginning to come out. There, people were hugging and tasting from each other's glasses and singing and. All of the earmarks of a super spreader event were there, and thank God that very few people there, as I understand it, got sick, but almost immediately after that, at the end of March, I was supposed to fly to Milan and spend 2 weeks in Piemonte, and of course that quickly became an epicenter, just as New York did. So that was off, and from there we just. First, you thought, we'll put it off 3 weeks, and it's a couple of months, and then, it kind of rolled into something nobody expected.
Yeah. The Piemonte trip, you missed the 15s and the 16s probably, which have been amazing, right? That would have been a heck of a time. And even later.
And I had a couple of good stories I wanted to do, and I hope they'll still be available to me.
I'm sure. That's like a high-class problem, having too much material,
but
right?
You know what really bummed me out? I was supposed to go to Tulsa, Oklahoma in July to give a talk on wine there, and I was going to get a private guided tour of the Bob Dylan Center. And of course that was out, and I'm so unhappy about that.
Didn't you tweet a Bob Dylan Charlie Brown cartoon today? Was that you?
I retweeted it. Yeah, because or Monday was his 80th birthday.
Right. Yeah, those are the things on top of the wine. And it's funny, you were alluding earlier, about seeing the people and everything. It just proves, and you know this better than anyone else, that wine is a lot more than a liquid in a glass.
Yeah,
and I've so always much wrapped around it.
Yeah, I've always approached it that way, and that's why it's I've never wanted to just do my job from a desk, because then you can't absorb all of the cultural elements that go into wine. It's far beyond just a beverage.
Can you? I think I've discussed this with you, but I don't mind doing it again for my listeners. There are a lot of people out there that review wines and rate them, and that's a whole nother show you and I could do, is wine ratings and all of that. Your job is not to rate wines or whatever. I mean, the elevator pitch of how you approach this, is what? Is that a fair question, Eric?
I think that's a fair question. It's, it's not a short answer, but if I were trying to boil it down, I would just say that wine, yes, it's a beverage, and it gives a lot of pleasure, and it's got to start there, but it can be so much more than that. And when you go into it and look at the traditions of wine, particularly in the old world, where these traditions go back generations, if not centuries, and you look at what wines can tell you about the people, and you begin to see them as expressions of a particular group of people or culture, just as their music, their dance, their food is, and it becomes much more resonant to me. And of course, it's also, wine is history, it's politics, it's economics, it's competition, it's health. All of these elements are part of wine, and of course there's the evaluation of it as an aesthetic object.
Right. And your role is not to, but the evaluation is not, numerical or whatever. I mean, it's a bigger story than that. That's, people don't turn to you for that.
Obviously there's good quality and not so good quality. And, a lot of culture wars are fought in wine over these issues. How do you assess that? What should standards be, and so on? And I don't shrink from that, but I don't believe in, the long the kind of mark of the critic as assessing individual bottles. I think that's just a method of creating a dependency for consumers on critics. And I get the imperative when you're working for a wine publication, but I have the luxury of working for a general interest publication, and people might come to me for other reasons.
Right, which is all good. Back to the pandemic.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the significant effects the pandemic had on the wine industry. I think that goes, crosses restaurants, consumers, retailers, people in, the profession, people's wine habits. I mean, did you get any feel that people's preferences and habits changed during the pandemic? Were they drinking more or less? How were they doing it? They weren't in restaurants?
Well, I think they're drinking differently, and of course, it's important to understand that the pandemic affected different people differently. Right. If you are, in the upper income brackets, chances are you did pretty well during the pandemic. And if you're not, if you're in a service job or in the arts or, any other sort of job that depended on interacting with the public regularly, you may not have done so well. And of course, that very much affects people's drinking habits. Restaurants, as I see it, and for, the section of the wine industry that I'm interested in, restaurants play a crucial role both in particularly in introducing people to new and different wines, in communicating, educating, and persuading people to try them. And when you take restaurants and sommeliers out of the equation, people are kind of left more on their own and tend not to be as exploratory and fall back on things that they know that they like. So,
well, yeah. Also, retailers, at the same point, restaurants were either shut down or, doing takeout. Retailers were closed and they were doing takeout. I mean, selling curbside. So the exploration of, going in a store and talking to the owner was gone. So did that create a shift to online and DTC?
Oh, absolutely.
Is that good or bad?
I think, I think that's good in the sense that, it allowed many small wine producers, American wine producers, to survive because, the business plan for many of them is to sell directly to restaurants and their products move through that, through those businesses with the help of sommeliers. These are all hand sell products. And that's true in retail also. And, when you don't have that interface, that human interface, the equation has to change. And I was surprised at a lot of American wineries that were able to pivot quickly to direct-to-consumer sales and just sort of build their websites and their DTC sales on the fly. That was really impressive.
You did a story discussing that, and a good chunk of the people in the story, if not all of them, made the pivot and did okay, survived, did well, right?
Yeah, I talked to a lot of these people at the beginning of the pandemic, and they were sort of in panic mode at the time. Right. And then, speaking to them a year later, they were themselves kind of surprised at how well they did. Of course, there other problems, came up for the American wine industry that had nothing to do with the pandemic, that in fact were far greater threats to their businesses than the pandemic turned out to be.
That would be climate change?
Well, yeah, at base climate change, but in particular the fires and what that did to their 2020 vintage.
I meant
yes.
Yeah. Let's talk about that in a minute. I want to just finish up on the pandemic thing, because categorically I kind of want to jump into that, focused on that. So wait, a couple things. So wineries pivoted to direct to consumer. In the end, do you think there'll be a net gain to DTC buyers, or will it fall off? I mean, to me, it sounds like a good thing for the long run. What do you think?
I don't think it will fall off. I think the old model for wineries with frequent trips to their big markets and a lot of in-person kind of thing. I think they've learned that that's not necessary, or at least not necessary to the extent that they were doing it before. Maybe instead of, taking 3 trips a year to New York, you might take 1, and just plan on a lot more online promotion. The bigger question, I think, is, how are restaurants going to respond? If you remember, a lot of restaurants sold off quite a bit of their inventory just to pay their bills. A lot of them let go their wine specialists. We don't know if they're going to be back. I think, the sense I get is that in high-end restaurants are always going to have a huge, a first-rate wine inventory, and to have, dedicated staff to buy and sell those wines. It's the mid-level restaurants that we don't really know about. And the other thing is that, the business model of American restaurants was really exposed. It's incredibly fragile. Employees are basically walking a tightrope, especially those that don't have health benefits, and, restaurants that are just barely staying ahead with rent and things like that. And who knows if Manhattan rents don't change, for example, whether the restaurant industry comes back to the extent that it had existed. I think eventually it will, because big cities thrive on having vibrant restaurant cultures, but it may take 5 years,
Right. It could be set back that long. I mean, that's not unrealistic, right?
And that's true. And one sommelier who I think is very smart was speculating to me that, in the future, wine destinations might well be outside of the big cities, because it's simply easier to pay for rent and for wine storage there. Except for the highest end restaurants, wine storage in Manhattan is
crazy,
incredibly difficult logistically.
So that points to 2 things. And tell me and expand. I think because of that, the restaurants that do come back are probably going to have smaller and more curated lists. And I think the idea, and you and I know a handful of restaurants that are, big and fancy and small and cool that have 3, 4, 5 somms working the floor. I don't think the somm thing is, I think a lot of people are going to flee the industry, and I don't think restaurants are going to be able to afford them. Do you agree with the curated list, smaller and somms sort of leaving?
I do think that's the direction we're heading, or if SOMs are not leaving entirely, they're going to be asked to do other jobs as well, which, really the best sommeliers were completely integrated into their restaurants and would just as soon bus a table as or as sell wine, because that's what good service people do. So it might weed out people who were more interested in the fame of the sommelier rather than the hospitality aspects of the job.
Right.
But one other thing is that a lot of people in the restaurant industry have said to me is that they fear that consumers will have gotten so used to paying retail costs for wine that they will not be willing to go back to restaurant costs.
So that'll bite into the, profits and... Yeah.
I mean, it may be that, restaurants will have to find a different way rather than, making wine their sole profit center. It may be that there's a whole new reckoning about how restaurant pricing is done, not just of wine, but of food.
Right.
And, I think we saw a little bit of that when Danny Meyer tried to eliminate tips in his restaurants, and we saw quite a bit of consumer resistance. So, I mean, we'll see what happens. Yeah.
So I think in order for restaurants to come back, there's going to have to be some reinvention. And, you noted a bunch of, things that will have to be addressed, the wine pricing, the change in personnel. SOMs are just not going to be these rock stars walking on the floor. They're going to have to run tables back to the kitchen. Getting employees back has been difficult. So we'll see what happens with that. All right, I want to jump to, we definitely could do hours on the pandemic. I want to jump to something that also has grabbed the headlines the past year, but may have been overshadowed. 2021 started with a terrible frost in France and Italy.
Yes.
And the summer, Eric, we're almost in June already, and the dry season is approaching in the western, U.S., where they've faced fires virtually every year. Unlike the pandemic, you can't create a vaccine to fight climate change, to fight the fires, to fight frost.
Yes.
Has climate change in a way been even more disruptive than the pandemic?
Absolutely. I think that, people are able to adapt to the pandemic. Adapting to climate change is way more difficult. And, if you think of California this year, they're in a drought emergency, and they already are lacking water. It's already been declared fire season in many parts of the state, and that's way early. And this is kind of the new normal. A lot of people said we're not dealing with climate change anymore. We're dealing with climate emergency, and I think that it's a lot bigger than the wine industry, obviously.
Yes. Agriculture.
Even agriculture. It's a public health emergency. It's a public emergency on every level, and unless serious steps are taken, it's hard to feel optimistic about. One thing that was interesting was when during the pandemic, when there was kind of a cessation of travel and everything, you saw in a lot of ways how the air cleared up, the water cleared up. I mean, nature has a way of being able to bounce back, but I would hate for anybody to feel so sanguine about that they felt, oh, we don't have to act on an emergency basis now. And, really, the wine industry is always the canary in the coal mine here. And what's happening with the frost, the deeply destructive frosts in Europe, and the even more destructive fires on the West Coast, it's you wonder, like, at what point does it become untenable for people?
Well, it's untenable. It's not untenable for some people, obviously, because people don't give a crap. I guess it falls into the governments of each country, and it requires a massive effort, right? I mean, it's just global.
Clearly, it's not just. It can't be approached on an individual basis. It has to be approached, on a global basis. And just, given the politics of getting anything done in the United States, much less India or China, you just have to hope against hope that people will realize that they have to overcome whatever their short-term interests are to get this together.
That's going to be difficult. If you micromanage this, if you take California, which has been fire-ridden, is there anything, individual wineries and the people that farm them, does moving towards sustainability, cover crops, more diversity? Does that help at a micro level, or?
Well, I think we all have to, do our part regardless of what happens at the government. You can't be fatalistic about it. And, I think there are elements of wine that really have to be rethought. It might surprise people to know that the, single biggest generator of carbon in the wine industry is glass bottles and shipping glass bottles around the world. And
is it the shipping and the manufacturing, or the shipping?
It's both.
Okay.
And there are easy things that can be done there. For example, people wineries can use bottles that are not nearly as massive as some of the luxury bottles that you see, and that's not hard. Jancis Robinson on her website has started, citing the weight of bottles in her wine ratings and
that's
calling out producers who get above a certain weight. And you know what? It's not just Napa Cabernet or Bordeaux.
I was going to ask you that.
A lot of natural wine producers are just as big offenders as the luxury goods and corporate wine producers. So that's one thing that needs to change. But then also think about the shipping. Certainly we all know that a lot of inexpensive wine is made from bulk wine, which is shipped around the world, not in individual glass bottles, but in big tanks and then bottled closer to where it's sold. And it may be that has to be extended to other sorts of wines. And there are a lot of obstacles to that. For example, appellation, a lot of appellation wines are required, if they want the appellation, to be bottled within the boundaries of that appellation. And maybe that has to change. And some other, you have to, one of the reasons for such rules is to prevent fraud.
Right.
But now in an era of climate change, maybe we have to rethink both how we can prevent fraud and how we can ship wine more more sustainably around the world.
I think there's always going to be resistance to change, but I think you're right. Inevitably, the change is going to have to come, along with other bigger things.
Yes, and of course, as you mentioned, agriculture is a big part of it here, and a lot of people will have. There's some very complex decisions that have to be made. People for centuries have traditionally tilled the soil, and that's maybe not a good thing for it releases a lot of carbon that otherwise would be stored in the soil. So people have to be open to thinking about no-till agriculture and various other alterations into what they've long done.
A more biodiverse environment, possibly, not just this well-manicured row of, vines. It may have to be.
That too.
Yeah. Eric, we have to take a quick break. We're talking to Eric Asimov. Eric Asimov writes for Wine for the New York Times. When we come back, we're going to get into a bunch of other things. You're listening to The Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. This episode is brought to you by Kermit Lynch Wine Merchant, an importer, retailer, and wholesaler of fine wine from France and Italy, headquartered in Berkeley, California. In 1972, Kermit Lynch opened a retail shop in Berkeley, California, with a $5,000 loan and a bit of gumption. He started with just 35 cases of wine stacked on the floor. Kermit grew his business from a retailer into a wholesaler and a national importer of wines from France and Italy. These wines are produced by small family growers who are committed to the old world traditions and culture. It is Kermit's belief that great wine is made in the vineyard, not the cellar. Much like his close friends, the late food writer Richard Olney and Chez Panisse founder Alice Waters, Kermit's influence has been enduring. He has spent nearly half a century shining the spotlight on small artisan producers. Learn more at KermitLynch.com. KermitLynch.com. We're back. We're back with my guest, Eric Asimov. Eric, there's so many contentious issues, but and I'm doing a wine podcast here, so I want to talk a little about wine too. You've always been a proponent and a cheerleader for quality to value wines. I mean, I know this firsthand from reading your columns forever. You annually recommend wines, for $20 and under. And the diversity and depth of these wines is incredible. It's just a great guide to go by. Is that price range, like the $20, is that the sweet spot for the majority of consumers? Is that why you do it? Is that where good wine starts? I mean, I know you've discussed this, the difference between a $10 bottle, but is that the sweet? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I would say the sweet spot is $15 to $25. So I've always, just picked arbitrarily $20 and done, several columns of year, 20 bottles that I recommend, all under $20. Is that the sweet spot for consumers? Well, if you read my email, I get an awful lot of people who complain that they don't want to spend that much. But,
Right.
my argument is that, if you want to spend $10, fine. But you don't have that many options at $10, where you have a lot of options at $15 to $25.
But fair to say, option of decent wines. I mean, there's a lot of wines that we're talking only decent wines, right?
Well,
good wine.
What do we mean by that? For a lot of people are just, they're looking for essentially an alcohol delivery system,
right.
And they just they want it to taste good to them and not be offensive, and they want to spend $5 to $10, and that's fine. But those are not the people who I'm writing for. My imaginary audience is interested in more than that. They're interested in wines that, as I said before, are expressions of culture, are products of tradition, that do have a sense of place, are made, with craftsmanship rather than mass produced. And when you're getting to the $10 and lower range, then you're talking about economies of scale and a lot of mass production and a lot of grapes from places that maybe are not really very expressive when it comes to wine. You're just talking about the equivalent of soft drinks then.
Right.
And I'm not telling people if they enjoy those wines, that's fine. But I'm recommending, I'm aiming higher in my mind, and writing about wines for people who want to go there with me.
Right. Which is also the wine school too.
Wine school's a slightly different thing, but the idea with that price range is that there's still a really wide range of wines that are made with craftsmanship, that do have a sense of place, that are expressions of culture. You're not going to get Burgundies there or Napa Cabernets, but you have access to a lot of different and unusual wines from around the world that are kind of, the mark of our current period in wine history. The fact that we have access to this incredible range of different wines that we never saw before.
So let's talk about that, because my listeners love recos. So we talked about the fact that you haven't been able to travel because of the pandemic. So here's a multi-pronged question, and I'll keep you focused on it. When will you commence travel to support your writing? And then, where are you going? But tie that into, tell me some regions and winemakers that have been catching your attention and interest, within the $20 and the beyond the $20 thing, so we're not boxed in, to that one thing.
Let's get away from the $20
okay.
thing because, because I'm still talking about value wines really at most levels that I'm writing about. And so, in the last year, the wines of Greece have grabbed me, and particularly the red wines of Greece, because we're, I won't say we're completely familiar with white wines from Greece, but we know them better than the red wines. And there's just some terrific wines of all sorts coming from Greece. Germany too.
Go back to Greece. Back to Greece for a second. On the reds, are we talking about a bunch of different grapes? Like when you talk Burgundy, you're talking Pinot. When you talk Greece, are you talking 3-4, different varietals?
We're talking about grapes that most of us, including me, know very little about.
Okay.
Maybe the most famous red grape from Greece is Mavro. which is really good, and it's kind of it's a little bit reminiscent of Nebbiolo with maybe with some Syrah, but I don't want to play that up too much. It's its own thing, and there's some terrific Zino Mavro wines, and they are probably the most promising in terms of ageability and developing complexity over time. But there are a lot of other reds coming from Greece too, and as well as a lot of interesting whites. And I'm always counseling people just to be open to these things.
That's the biggest thing. You had mentioned Germany, so continue.
Yeah, Germany too. Germany has wonderful Rieslings, but there's so much beyond Riesling as well. Not just Pinot Noir, but there's there's a growing natural wine scene both in Germany and in Greece. There are Trollinger, for example, known as Schiava in northeastern Italy. That's a lovely red wine. And there's all kinds of other kind of ancient grapes like Elbling, which is a very interesting white, and you haven't seen
spell Elbling.
Elbling. It's Elbling.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Or it could be Ebling. No, I think it's Elbling.
Yeah,
I get confused without my reference books in front of me all the time. There's Sylvaner, for example, is another grape that we kind of dismiss, but it can be wonderful.
Right. Is there? Those are. Greece is less well known and established than Germany, but your point with Germany is it goes beyond Riesling. Are there any regions that we know about that I wouldn't say a renaissance, but you're just excited again about the wines? Like Psalms have been talking about Chianti, when they haven't been for 10.
I talk about Chianti all the time, and I have another article upcoming on Chianti.
Tell me a little about that.
Well, Sangiovese is one of my favorite grapes. I just love it, and it can be so good. And I found over time that I'm currently just so crazy about Chianti Classico, and these wines have never been better than they are now. There's a whole range of great producers there, and I think they're just really hitting their stride. And I'm talking mostly about the Normale bottlings, just Chianti Classico, not Riserva, not the Gran Selezione, which are the higher end expressions, but just plain Chianti Classico. They're so good and so interesting and so expressive. And I like other expressions of Sangiovese. I love Brunello, and I love Vino Nobile and Sangiovese from other parts of Italy. But really, Chianti Classico has just grabbed my attention in a big way. And some of those wines are getting a little bit more expensive, but a lot of really good ones are still in the $20 to $30 range and are terrific.
That show really well, that really are good food whites too. Silly question, back against the wall, do you pick Nebbiolo over Sangiovese or Sangiovese over Nebbiolo, or there's a love, or that's like saying who's your favorite kid?
Yeah, I mean, I love them both, but right now I find my attention focused more on Sangiovese than Nebbiolo. These things change, though,
Yeah, that's good.
Let's go beyond Sangiovese. Let's just stipulate that Nebbiolo is just a brilliant grape. But what about Dolcetto, for example?
Yes.
That's another one that gets, easily dismissed, and nobody really wants to talk about it. But Dolcetto is a wonderful grape, and there's so many excellent expressions right now of Dolcetto that are really reasonably priced.
Right. I was just going to say, similar to Chianti, compared to the Barolos, even Barbarescos, they're reasonably priced and they're terrific. I'm glad you brought that up because those are some, Italy is so vast, but those are some, well-known opportunities.
And I've also been really getting into Italian whites and I was going to mention another region, Montepulciano, and the Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, which, this area is very well-priced wines. There used to be, mostly big companies and the wines weren't that interesting, but I've noticed in the last decade that, a lot of younger producers are going in there and just making beautiful wines. And the white Trebbiano d'Abruzzo
is
can
terrific.
Be so good, and it's important to distinguish that particular grape, Trebbiano d'Abruzzo, from the vast number of other Trebbianos in Italy that are in fact different grapes. The actual Trebbiano d'Abruzzo grape is just wonderful and makes really fascinating wines.
Yeah, and there's some terrific makers. Eric, a couple things. I do a thing called the wine list, which you've done before. I want to do it with you. I ask my guests 5 questions about their preferences. They're the same questions I asked you the last time.
Well, it's a good thing I don't remember.
Yeah, you won't. No, and things change too. So, I want to see that. I'll actually do a comparison. But before I get into that, I'm curious. Have you had that meal outside of the house, sort of post-pandemic?
Yes.
Have you done that yet? What was? Did you order wine? What was it?
Yes. I never stopped going. I ate outdoors all summer and into the fall at restaurants, and I kind of stepped back during the winter because I don't need to go to a restaurant badly enough to be freezing or sitting in one of those ridiculous enclosed shelters that are a poor excuse for eating outside.
Yeah,
but
I did it once.
I'm completely vaccinated and have been back in restaurants and
because I actually bump into people that I just went out for the first time. I wanted to make sure that that wasn't you. Good. All right.
But I did have like a return to restaurant meal. I guess it was in the beginning of April. That was kind of a celebration both of vaccination, and I had just gotten over COVID then myself. I had it in this
past April?
I got it at the end of February 2021.
Wow. I got it in March 20.
So
what did you drink? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
Okay, that's okay. That's okay.
Whatever was, there are some.
It didn't matter, right?
Yeah, there were some great wines at that restaurant. I do remember going to Ernesto's and having some great Spanish whites, and that's
downtown.
Another thing I've been fascinated with recently. Are unfortified Palomino wines from the Jerez region of Spain, sherry country, made with the sherry grape, but that are not fortified. And this is a whole new kind of field for me or I've had them before, but there's just a bunch of really good ones right now that have been fascinating to me.
So this is Palomino, you're saying?
Yes, that's the grape.
Okay.
Right.
All right. And this is an area I'm not, well versed in. Is Palomino a sherry or it's not a sherry?
No, that's the name of the grape. that you see in sherry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that's what you're drinking. All right. Maybe we'll talk about that in the wine list. So here's the wine list. 5 questions. Don't dwell on the answers. Buzz through them. You can give me one answer, a couple answers. The first question is, what are you drinking now? You sort of answered that. And the question is usually, what's in your fridge? What are you trying?
Yeah.
I'm
in the middle of my Chianti Classico. So I'm
that's
drinking a lot of Chianti Classico.
That's one I was going to say. You sort of answered the question. You have this Palomino, thing.
This Palomino, I'm exploring that as well.
What else?
And, I always have a lot of Chablis around.
Okay.
And especially in the summer, Italian whites. I mentioned the Trebbiano.
What else? Italian whites? Like Vermentino? I mean, what else do you like?
Verdicchio, Fiano, Suave, Gavi. There's so many good ones.
There is.
Etna Bianco.
Etna Bianco.
Fantastic.
All right, those are good ones.
Yeah.
All right, so this would be a good question to compare when we did it years ago to now. It's the goofiest question on the list, but do you have a favorite wine and food pairing? Certainly not something you eat every month, every week, but something, not what you think is a good wine and food pairing, but something that you love, something that just works for you. Could be simple as steak and Cabernet, or it could be something crazy.
Well, I'm actually loving steak and Chianti Classico.
Okay.
But yes, crab cakes and white Burgundy are a great combination.
You answered the question. I'm going to put down steak and Chianti Classico because I think you're dead on that. And crab cakes and white Burgundy is a pretty good answer too. I like that one. I don't remember. I asked this question.
One other
go ahead.
Wine that I should mention in terms of Italian whites. Aligoté from Burgundy is a terrific substitute and goes with a lot of the dishes that you'd want an Italian white for, whether pesto or linguine with clams or dishes like that.
It's got a little body to hold up against those foods.
And of course, this is summer. If the weather were a little cooler, I'd be roasting chickens and drinking it with Northern Rhone wines, Saint Joseph or Cornas.
You're among my favorite wines. We kicked this year off with Jean Gonan, who really doesn't do a lot of interviews, and it was terrific to have him on.
He's a great guy.
He makes incredible wine. I got to taste on the show with him. We talked about his wines. That was fun. All right, third question. And if this is awkward or it feels like, you're excluding things, but favorite wine restaurant and or bar, and it's only in the context of who serves great wine, who has a great vibe, who's got a good wine list, who's got people that are knowledgeable. It doesn't have to be fancy. Like I said, it could be a bar. Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really so into fancy restaurants right now, but yes, the one restaurant that comes to mind immediately is King.
Yes.
In Soho. I love that restaurant.
All around food, Annie's wines, everything,
Yes.
the vibe. They're very good about it. There's a nice, curated wine list. All right, fourth question. The question is favorite all-time wine. I think when I first asked you this question, I think what I was going for was, Eric, what was the most expensive rare wine you ever drank? The question has morphed into, I don't give a crap to that answer. The question is, Eric, favorite all-time wine, what's that important wine to you? What's the wine that changed the way you think about wine or had an impression or turned you on to Burgundy? Is there an important wine, that's significant to you?
Well, I mean,
wines.
The thing is that, and I have fought this question because I don't think that one just has a single epiphany.
I agree.
I've had many wine epiphanies, And, I can
See,
name
epiphany's the answer. The epiphany is more important than the wine to me.
Yeah, I can name the first wine epiphany I had, and it was a 78 Barbera d'Alba from Giacomo Conterno, which back when I drank it in 1982 was like an $8 bottle and is now probably like an $80 bottle. Right. I can talk about a 1955 La Mission, which was the first great older wine I had ever had on my, I bought it for my parents' 30th wedding anniversary in 1985. And
that's close to a birth year too, right?
Well, it's a little older than I am, I'm happy to say.
Okay.
But I can talk about the first red Burgundy that I remember, which was a modest wine, Haute Côte de Nuit, that just I blew me away. I can talk about the first Mosel Riesling from J.J. Prum Cabinet. That, these are all wines that help me in my journey. And, are they the most precious wines I've ever had, or the rarest, or,
Right, well, yeah, that wasn't the point. These,
right. But these
I hate to use the word, but they're
wines,
like gateway wines or something.
That's, for me, they taught me something important that propelled me in a different direction. And, I've said before, I've learned about wine from the bottom up. And I'm forever grateful for my particular wine education and journey, because I'm a consumer of all sorts of wines, and I believe that the everyday bottles that we drink are more important than the most precious, rarest, most profound bottles that we drink, because they're the ones that really set the tone for how we think about wine. Even as these profound bottles kind of stretch the context for us.
Right. That's a great, that's a great point, and I agree with that. And it almost validates a little how silly the question is, but we will move on. Last question is, this is your wheelhouse, and I've been asking it for over 4 years. And our listeners love to tell me the best wine around $15-20. Give me a red, give me a white. With you, I don't want to get, we just talked about, with you, I don't want to get into specific winemakers. And if we're repetitive, that's fine. Just give me regions or wines. What's the great value white, the great value red? Red, do we settle on Chianti Classico?
No, because those, you have to go up. They're closer to 25 than 15.
Okay, 15 to 20. So give me a red.
You might be talking about Montepulciano, d'Abruzzo, and there's some really good producers there. And you might be and I would probably be talking about Italian whites. As a whole field.
You mentioned Verdicchio, Soave, a bunch of other things, Etna Bianco,
Fiano.
Those all fit in the $20-ish, 18, $20, right? Okay.
Yes.
All right.
I mean, there's probably a lot more, and I should mention the wines of Portugal, but they're probably a little bit more expensive.
Yeah, but they're good value. I took the family to Portugal a couple of years ago. We went to Alentejo and Port, and I mean, it's just awesome. It's like Italy. The people are friendly. The food is amazing. The wine is amazing. Aesthetically, it's gorgeous.
The language is a little more difficult, but
yeah, I didn't know what was going on. And I took Spanish in high school, but still, it's Portuguese. All right, yes. Eric, we got to wrap up. I told you now we'd go pretty quickly. Let me do a quick wrap up, and then I just want to get a couple of cues from you. So if you have a question, suggestion, wine happening, or event, hit me up at sam@thegrapenation.com. That's sam@thegrapenation.com. Subscribe to the Grape Nation podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. Follow us on Facebook at The Grape Nation. On Instagram, we're at SBenRuby. On Twitter, we're at BenRuby. But you can always use the hashtag The Grape Nation to get to us on both. We're trying to build a little community on Clubhouse, so follow us on Clubhouse at BenRuby. I forgot to mention this, Eric. We will post your wine list on our social media sites. People love to see and hear, what you recommended. And I think you carry a lot of sway with that. Eric, if we want to find you on social media, where can we go?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Eric Asimov.
Okay, that is your full name. Your column appears in the food section every Wednesday, pretty much, and the wine
every
school
Wednesday, and it's posted online generally
Monday or Tuesday.
No, it's usually the Thursday before.
Oh, that far ahead.
Yeah,
okay.
So it's almost a week before, but not always.
Okay. So you can get it in paper on Wednesday and about Thursday or Friday online. And the wine school is about once a month?
Once a month, yeah.
Same thing? Does it come out early online, or?
It's the same thing, and in that we taste a different wine every month, and there's a lot of interaction between me and readers,
you taste with Psalms, restaurant people.
No. That's another thing entirely.
Oh, right.
That's
what is that
our New York Times wine panel, which has been on hiatus for the pandemic.
Right. Where you taste 2, 3, 4 wines or even more.
20 is the protocol.
20?
Yeah.
All right. So
wine school is 3.
Right. That's where I'm confused. So we hope to see that soon. Any books? Any other writing in the works?
Always something in the works, but not ready to talk about it yet.
All right. You'll let me know, and then when the right time comes. All right, Eric, I want to thank our guest, Eric Asimov from the New York Times. You've been very insightful, and you've helped us navigate getting out of this silly pandemic. I appreciate you coming on. For the month of May, we brought back old friends. We had Eric on today. We had Raj Parr on. We had Pascaline Lepeltier. And we had Dustin Hoffman. And, Dustin's opening a new restaurant. Raj moved from Santa Barbara to Cambria to a regenerative farm. Pascaline is reopening her restaurant. So it's been great, to talk to everybody about that. And Eric, I thank you for, anchoring this at the end. I
thank you for having
coming
me.
on. Yes. Thank you to our engineer, Amanda, and everyone at the Heritage Radio Network. I'm Sam BenRuby, and you've been listening to The Grape Nation. The Grape Nation is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. For our freshest content, subscribe to our newsletter. Enter your email at the bottom of our website, heritageradionetwork.org. Connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at heritage_radio. You can also find us at facebook.com/Heritage Radio Network. Heritage Radio Network is a nonprofit organization driving conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place. And we couldn't do it without support from listeners like you. Want to be part of the food world's most innovative community? Subscribe to the shows you like, tell your friends, and please join the HRN family by becoming a member. Just click on the beating heart at the top right of our homepage. And thanks for listening.